When we are somewhere strange, it's common for us to look for something familiar to comfort us. When you go on holiday, I don't know if you're the very adventurous type of person that tries to go for all the local and exotic cuisine, or whether you look for the first place that says British above the door so that you can get something that reminds you of home. But that's especially for Brits for some reason, an inordinately common trait to have, is because it can be a little bit disconcerting being in an alien surrounding and setting. And I don't know about you, but that's certainly the way I feel as a post-2000-year New Testament Christian, reading some of these books that are in the Bible, like Joshua. I think it is a bit unsettling, and it does feel a bit alien, reading about particularly conquest and violence. And folks often ask me about these books and what we do with them, and they're quite often used as a strong argument that there's not really much validity to either the Bible or the Christianity or faith because of them, because we've kind of moved past that understanding of things. And so we have to try and find a way to orient ourselves and have to answer the question, well, what do we do with that? And for better or worse, that's part of my job, to try and help you do some of that this morning, I hope. So I'm going to try to look for something that is familiar. Because we are Christians, so if we are New Testament Christians, and we do try and base and pattern our lives and our expression of faith on the words and also the teaching and the modeling and the life of Jesus, then how on earth is that consistent with what we have here? So I'm going to try to answer that. But to get into the story, let's think of what's disorientating for the people of Israel at this point. Let's try and read the story along with the grain of the text that's here, because they have come from Egypt, they've been an enslaved people, and now they're in a really strange situation that they don't recognize. For the first time, all they've heard about for generations is that God had promised them this land. They're now on it, and their feet are on that soil, but there's so much change that's going on. I want to think about the fact that God gives them certain things to anchor them and to anchor us through this story. He gives them a reminder about their identity. He gives them hope even in the midst of all the change. And he also gives them an opportunity to see him at work. So we're going to look at these three things and hopefully answer some of the questions that you have about the text. Certainly not all of them. Now, before, when we were here 2 weeks ago, we had Mark last week. So 2 weeks ago, we got to the point where the Jordan River was stood as a barrier and as a way that kind of an existential blockade between them and their destiny and what God had promised to them and asked them to do. And so God miraculously removed the waters as he had done in the Exodus in Egypt, and he got them across safely in one piece. And they experienced so much change in that, because you'll recall the Ark of the Covenant for the first time was not leading them and guiding them, and they had very little guidance except having to be faithful to what they'd been asked to do. So they were stepping out into new and uncharted territory. So here they are now in it, and this is their first major civilization settlement that is opposed to them. But we know a bit about Jericho because they'd already sent spies there who had a report from being taken in by Rahab, and we considered the amazing story of grace and also how Rahab would have been very much considered an outsider to the people of God and to Israel, and yet that's exactly who God was looking to fold into and to include in what he was doing. Now, the first thing I want to explain by way of background and context that'll help us read this is really ancient writing and a really ancient document in the history book of Joshua. And there are many features in it that are consistent with the way history, and indeed religious history, was written at the time. And so the Old Testament particularly, and the New to an extent, is a really perplexing mixture of things that are very consistent for the time it's written and some things that are highly unusual and really jump out. Now, the bits in this that are highly consistent with what's written at the time are Firstly, the fact that Joshua curses the city, and that, at the end of the chapter Eileen read for us, that nobody was going to be able to build or should not build on the threat of a curse ever again, that city. We have records from Phoenician kings that are extant from around the same time, and on their tombs they would often etch a curse against anyone who would dare to disturb their remains, and their families would be plagued and so on. So, not unusual for the time and the setting in which it's written. And then also the language about the totality of conquest was incredibly common. If you were to read any ancient literature from the Egyptian period, particularly in their ascendancy, or the Mesopotamian empires, when they describe how they went to war with other peoples, it was always in the most exaggerated and in the most totalizing of terms. Everybody was wiped out. It was an unmistakable conquest of annihilation. Okay, so that maybe doesn't necessarily soften the edge of what we read and how much it jars against our sensibilities, but it does show you that a lot of the Old Testament is completely in keeping with the writings of the time. But I think the things that we're going to focus on today do make it somewhat distinct and give us some familiarity to hang on to from what we know about New Testament Christianity. So firstly, that God reminds them and introduces them as his people to their identity, and he gives that to them. The Lord said to Joshua to circumcise the Israelites again. And not only that, but once he does that, then they're going to celebrate a Passover together. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, which is when Passover was to be kept, while they camped in Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, Israel celebrated the Passover. Now, what was the point in getting everyone circumcised again? Well, it's been a long time for those people since they had a connection to where they came from. They had been enslaved for ostensibly hundreds of years. They had then had another long journey where a whole generation had passed away while they were in the wilderness. And even more of a distant memory than Moses and the dramatic rescue from the Exodus was the fact that they even existed as a people at all, which was God's call to Abraham. You remember back in Genesis 12 and 15, where God promises Abraham that he will bless him, that God will be his covenant and personal God, and that he will make his children more numerous than the stars of the night sky. And as a sign of all that, then Abraham was to circumcise his descendants. And it was a way of marking the identity that they were taking part in these promises, that the God of the heavens and the earth, who'd created the universe and all that was therein, that he had made himself known to Abraham in a personal way. And so what God was doing with the people through Joshua here was saying, there's a lot that's happened. A lot of it has left them feeling disorientated. Here is a reminder of who they are. Here's a reminder of who they connected to. Here's a reminder that everything that they are and that they have is dependent upon and a result of God's special choosing grace, which is what God did with Abraham. Here's a reminder that God has desired to enter into the sacred bond with the people. And all the implications of that God will be with them, that God is watching over them, as so many of their psalms and songs celebrate. Here is a reminder of that God has previously given them these dramatic actions and rescued them, eating the Passover bread. And there's reminders for us too, because this does trace all the way into the New Testament. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant, and then Paul, when he's speaking in Ephesians chapter 2, talks about our sign, which is Christ's death on the cross. It's co-equal with the giving a marker that lets people know that they belong. Unfortunately, for us who are Christians who believe it's not circumcision now, but it is simply believing that sacrificial death of Christ on the cross brings in and puts an identity marker on anybody that would look to find themselves underneath that. And it includes so many more different kinds of people. But it's important to remember where we came from. People perish without identity markers. Cultures lose their sense of place and time if they don't have things to remind them of their ancestry. And it's the same in the journey of faith. For us this morning, maybe it's been a while since we've paused and remembered the way God called us into fellowship and faith with himself and gave us that marker and that identity that we belong to him. And sometimes in our journey, God will give us times like this, perhaps before or after something significant in life, to remember that the same God who called Abraham and blessed him and gave him these great promises calls us to connect with him and to know him and gives us that very same identity of belonging to the people of God. And there are so many reasons that we can be involved in church life and to Christianity, but at the heart of it is this, that God has, if you like, set a sacred seal and mark over us and says, you belong to me. You belong to the group of people that I've called to myself, and I bless them with my name. Or to use one of Paul's favorite phrases, in Christ. It is to actually partake in the Messiah and in his life. Isn't that a wonderful thought? And it's picked up, and the New Testament runs with it because of how sacred a promise it was that God chose a people and drew them into his life and fellowship. And then God gives them these wonderful pictures of hope amidst all the change that they're going through. And it's huge change, because we read that in verse 11, the day after Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. Now, if you read over that bit too fast, you'll absolutely miss the significance of it for this people, and also within the kind of the totality of the story of the historical books and the first 5 books of Moses, because so much of the thrust of where it's going, of what God is promising to do to deliver the people in the Exodus through Moses, is that he has something better for them. They may be an oppressed and enslaved people right now, but there is a day coming where God will provide them a plentiful land and where they will eat the produce of that land. They were commanded in Exodus chapter 13 that when they got there, not if, like in 2 generations' time, when they got there, to sit and to eat the Passover meal, to remember what God had done for them and how they had achieved that journey. And all of these promises are beginning to be fulfilled with this group of people here. And there's a few things going on there. One of the big changes, of course, the manna is stopping. The miraculous bread from heaven, the provision that God made that was falling, and which they were able to go out and eat every morning without having to worry or think about, well, where are we going to eat in the wilderness? And God did that, and it's now stopping. And we thought about this a couple of weeks ago, so I won't spend too much time on it, but God is taking them from one phase to another. The era of the wilderness, handout, dependence kind of era is changing for them. And God is now wanting them to see, look, you're not slaves anymore and you're not nomads anymore. You're now going to become a settled people in a land that actually has produce and will provide for your sustenance. And so this is what you're moving into now. I'm going to take off the stabilizers, so to speak. And you're going to have to learn how to do that. But God doesn't do that without providing what they need. They eat the grain and the produce of the land. If you like, here, before they've had the chance to even have a settlement yet, God says to them, here is a foretaste of what you can have and what you will have. And one of the main bedrocks of Christian doctrine is that there's a great Hebrew word for it, Jehovah Jireh, that God is our provider. And a large part of what it means to be in relationship with God and Christianity is to believe, perhaps sometimes despite all evidence to the contrary, that God is providing for us, that God is a God of providence, and that he continues to watch over us and to provide from one day and week and month and year to the next. And that doesn't mean it's not challenging. I don't think it was without apprehension or fear that the many millions of the children in Israel went from relying on having manna to then having to go, right, well, we need to eat the produce of the land now. I'm sure, given what else we see in the books of Moses, that it wasn't without grumbling or difficulty or some dissent within the ranks of the people. Perhaps for some it didn't even look or feel like providence in any way. And sometimes God's providence doesn't. And sometimes we're minded to question whether God is providing for us, or knowing he's provided something, but asking, well, why did he provide that? All these questions are common. But I think the hopefulness that we can draw from that and from this story is that despite all of our questions and despite our inability to see what is going on in the moment, that God is absolutely overseeing it, that God is absolutely with us and has not left us, abandoned us, or forgotten us. And that God sometimes, not always, but sometimes, may be engendering greater maturity in us and moving us from one source of relying on him to the next. I don't know what that looks like for you in your life. All I can offer you is the fact that I have found God to be dependable and to continue to provide, even when I have questioned it, and I have often enough. But he does, and he gives us hope that we are continuing to move forward even amidst great change. Can I belabor the point again that as a church, I believe God is continuing to move us forward even amidst great change in our society, great change in our world, great change in our community, great change in the church nationally, locally, and at every level. But we're here, and we're continuing to speak the gospel and the good news of God working and drawing people to himself and making them part of his covenant family. And so, is that not in itself that despite all the change, God is continuing to give us hope that there's something that we're continuing to move towards, that there is for want of a better term, a good land that he is calling us to. We might not recognize it, and it might not look like what we think it does. But he's there, and he's in it, and he's providing it. And so God gives us identity and also so much to hope for, even amidst great change. And then lastly, which is the sort of Sunday school bit of the story that we all know so well, is the end of chapter 6. When on the seventh day, after 6 days of marching once, the seventh time around, the priests shout, and Joshua commanded the army to shout, for the Lord has given you this city. And the city of Jericho falls, and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in the house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent. And the trumpet sounded, and the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the walls collapsed, and everyone charged in, and they took the city. Now, there's a lot going on here. One of the things, that language that you see of the city being devoted to God, it's a common Semitic term, which was harim, which meant to totally either consecrate something or to make sure that it was unfit for any human use except to be sort of religiously used and devoted to God. And there's a bit of ambiguity there. We don't entirely know whether that means kill or just sort of disfigure the city so that it's not really fit for human habitation. Regardless, it's part of the unpleasant stuff that we are questioning. Well, what do we do with that? There are you can get various apologetic arguments that that the Canaanite cities were particularly wicked, and that it was sort of doing them a favor by wiping them out. There are other ones that say that it's all just hyperbole, so even though God said, and they reported to be a total annihilation. That's not, we don't have any historical records that's ever really what was done. It's just an ancient people really talking themselves up. It's up to you if you find any of those particularly satisfactory. I tell you what though, there's a lot to be said for reading the Bible in an engaged way and in a way that actually wrestles with these texts and sits with the discomfort of what they cause. Let me deal with the 6 and the 7, the 6 days and the 7 days, and then let me finish it with something that I find hopeful and consistent with the message of Jesus in the story. So the 6 and the 7 days, they march around for 6 days and nothing happens. And then on the 7th day, the city walls fall. And I think all of that is symbolically important because they're going in, and what they're told to do by God looks much more like a religious procession than it does an army really marching for war. They're told to arrange themselves so they've got the Ark of the Covenant and all their religious articles right in the center. They've got a well-organized group to the fore and to the rear, and there's trumpets, and they go around, and then they just stop, and they don't do or really say very much. And they do that for 6 days. And then finally, on the 7th day, they're told to open up their voices and to shout, and the walls come down. So here's what I think is going on with that. The numbers are just never an accident in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. Doing anything for 6, roughly, in the Bible corresponds to man, humanity, earth, creatureliness. And then 7 usually speaks of the perfection and the completion and the goodness of God. And that's consistent right the way through to, I hope I don't trigger too many of you by saying Revelation. The book of Revelation is also very much based on these numbers. I think what God was saying through this story is, I'm going to not let you win this with the traditional means and weapons of warfare, but by doing something ordinary, walking, marching, which you're good at doing, and then leaving a margin or a space for me to do only what I can do. Because none of them would have been able to bring down the walls with their shout. It was not their shout that brought down the walls. It was clearly an act of God and his perfection, doing only what he was able to do. And here's what I think there's a relevance and a lesson for us. I think there's a great pattern there for Christian living that God gives us. I think he gives us opportunity and space for him to work in our lives. I've met so many Christians over the years, and I've often been in contexts where there's a huge focus on kind of hearing from God. What does God want me to do, and what is God's will for my life, and what should I do in this situation and that and the next? And here's what I think is a really helpful pattern, is for us to do what we know we can do, and to get on with it, and to, not spend a lot of time sitting and wondering and worrying, and then to always leave space for the fact that God just might do something beyond what we are able to do. Do you see what I mean? Because I think God has given us abilities to just walk. And walking in the Bible is, again, always symbolic of putting one foot in front of the other and just going about doing your life. So do your life. Do it as much and as well as you can. And leave a bit of space and margin for God to do what only he can do in your life, whether that is by whatever that looks like for you, prayer, fasting, Bible reading, study, time out, or even just hoping in God to do something. But more significantly, for us to kind of, I think, have something that we can hang on to with these stories. And while I won't be able to tie up all the loose ends, I think what you have to do as a Christian is read. We have the whole Bible for a reason. Is to take it in its final form as an entire book that progressively and continually shows the revelation of who God is in Jesus Christ, as we're told by the Apostle Paul. Or as John says, he's the image of the invisible God. And so, whatever portraits we have of God, I would say that the guiding rubric and the way all of them are superseded is by when we look into the face of Jesus and we consider his actions and his words, we have the most fully orbed and final form of what God has wanted to reveal about what he is truly like to us. And I think when you read the whole Bible with that guiding you, then you see that it's actually moving towards that. And the Bible's a very unique collection of texts because we have some really, really old writing here. And as I said at the start, some of the really old writing is very consistent with writings that were made at that time. But there's wee flecks and bits and pieces that if you read them in the support of the rest of the Bible, and particularly with the life and the death of Jesus, then they show you this kind of golden thread of hopefulness and of grace. Because what does Joshua say at the end? After they've devoted the city to destruction, at that time Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: "Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild a city, and at the cost of his firstborn son he will lay its foundations, at the cost of his youngest he will set up its gates." So curse is a strong theme in the Old Testament, and there's an understanding from Genesis onwards that the whole of our world is underneath some sort of curse that none of us are able to undo. And Joshua there takes part in perpetuating that and saying, you know what, let's just do more of the same. He takes what is, for most of us, the most unimaginable, unconscionable thing, to lose one's own offspring, and he uses that as a totalizing demonstration of what his wish is for his enemies. And you see, Christ gives us not only the permission, but the encouragement to reinterpret, because he often says, "You have heard that it was said," even about some of the Old Testament, "but I say to you." So the words here are, "Cursed be anyone, may it be at the cost of their firstborn son." And then what we have in the New Testament is God the Father coming and saying, actually at the cost of my firstborn son, this curse will be undone, in a way that we can all put out hope for the violence and the unending cycle of hostility and wickedness in the world to actually find a solution and to actually find some breakthrough that gets us out of the cycle of that mess. And at the cost of his firstborn son was humanity finally able to have an answer and finally able to put their hope in someone who told us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to lay down our weapons, and to work for peace and justice and love. And so, I don't think God changes. I think we change. I think we're fickle, highly fickle. But I think God has always been working with, in, and through the changefulness and the sinfulness of humanity to give us an identity in him that we're all able to share and join in on, to give us hope even amidst all the change that we experience, and most importantly, to give us opportunities to see him at work and to exercise faith. And the greatest demonstration of that was where he gave us and sacrificed his own son in order to do what none of us were able to do with all our labor and effort, is to provide for the forgiveness of sins and to reconcile us back to him. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.